The rise of the Roman Empire, the dawn of Rome. There was once a land bathed in the golden light of a Mediterranean sun, a land of hills, rivers, and restless spirits. Long before the world knew empires, before marble arches and triumphal processions, there was only a cluster of huts on 7 hills, overlooking a winding river called the Tiber. Here, amid swamps and forests, shepherds watched their flocks, unaware that their humble village would one day command the world. Rome. A name not yet spoken with reverence, merely a whisper among the Latins, a people caught between myth and survival. But destiny, as it often does, had already chosen its stage. According to legend, the story of Rome begins not with men, but with the gods. A tale of vengeance, love, and divine intervention, a story carried by the wind across centuries. Aeneas, a warrior of Troy, fled his burning city after its fall. Guided by prophecy, he wandered the seas until he reached the shores of Italy. There, his descendants would build kingdoms, their blood mingling with that of the native tribes. And generations later, from this divine lineage, 2 brothers were born, Romulus and Remus. They were abandoned by the river, left to die. But fate refused to forget them. A she-wolf, symbol of strength and ferocity, nursed the infants until they were found and raised by a shepherd. When they became men, they sought to build a city. Yet, as so often happens in stories destined for greatness, blood was the price of ambition. Romulus, in a moment of rage or destiny, slew his brother Remus. And from that fratricide, Rome was born, named after its first king, carved from both glory and guilt. Thus began the Age of Kings. For nearly 2.5 centuries, Rome was ruled not by emperors, but by kings, some wise, some cruel, all remembered in shadow and stone. The first, Romulus, gathered fugitives and shepherds, offering refuge to all who sought it. He built walls, marshaled armies, and gave his fledgling city order. But even he could not foresee the centuries to come, the Senate that would outlive monarchs, or the legions that would one day march beneath the eagle. Under the kings, Rome learned the art of governance and war. The Sabines, neighboring tribes, became both enemies and kin. One of the earliest tales tells of the Sabine women, abducted, yet later choosing to stay, binding 2 peoples into one nation. This pattern, of conquest and assimilation, would define Rome for all time. The kings built temples, bridges, and sewers, laying the bones of a city that would one day become the heart of civilization. Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king, began the Great Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems, a marvel of engineering that still endures. Servius Tullius expanded the walls, organized citizens into classes, and gave them a sense of belonging. But power has a way of curdling into tyranny. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled with arrogance and cruelty. His son's crime against a noblewoman, Lucretia, would ignite a revolution. Her suicide became a symbol of virtue and defiance, her blood the seed of freedom. In 509 BCE, the kings were driven out, and Rome was declared a republic. The republic rises. From monarchy to republic, Rome transformed itself again, a phoenix rising from the ashes of tyranny. The people swore that never again would one man rule them as king. Instead, they would entrust power to 2 consuls, chosen annually, to prevent the return of tyranny. Around them stood the Senate, an assembly of Rome's elder statesmen, guardians of law and tradition. Yet the promise of equality was not yet fulfilled. Society remained divided between patricians, the noble elite, and plebeians, the common people. The struggle between them would shape the republic's destiny. The early years were marked by survival. Rome fought her neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the Latins and Sabines around her, and the Volsci to the south. Through resilience and cunning, Rome endured, often rebuilding from defeat stronger than before. It was during these centuries that Rome learned her greatest strength, discipline. Unlike her rivals, who fought for plunder or pride, Rome fought with purpose, adapting, evolving. She built alliances, rewarded loyalty, and turned enemies into citizens. As the Republic matured, its armies became the backbone of its power. Every citizen could be a soldier. Every soldier carried not just a sword, but the weight of Rome's destiny. When Rome's legions marched, they did so not for a king, but for the idea of Rome itself. The conquest of Italy. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had outgrown her small beginnings. But she was not yet a superpower, merely one city among many in the Italian peninsula. That would soon change. Her first great trial came from the north, from the Gauls. In 390 BCE, a barbarian horde descended upon Rome. The city was burned. The sacred geese of Juno were said to have sounded the alarm as the Gauls scaled the Capitoline Hill. It was a humiliation that would haunt Rome for generations. But from that ruin came resolve. Rome rebuilt, brick by brick, vow by vow, and swore that never again would an enemy set foot upon her soil. She began to expand, not recklessly, but methodically. Neighboring Latin cities were absorbed, Etruscan fortresses conquered, and the Samnites, fierce warriors from the mountains, fought Rome in 3 long and brutal wars. The Samnite Wars tested everything Rome had built. Her legions were ambushed in the narrow Caudine Forks and forced to surrender. Yet Rome did not yield. She restructured her armies, developed roads to move troops swiftly, and eventually crushed her foes. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome was the master of Italy. But her success drew the gaze of another power, a city across the sea, wealthy and ancient, Carthage. The Punic Wars. Carthage, the jewel of North Africa, mistress of trade, with ships that ruled the western Mediterranean. Rome's destiny would now collide with hers, and the result would shape history forever. The First Punic War began over a small island, Sicily. It was a conflict of ambition disguised as defense. Rome, a land power, built her first navy, learning the art of sea battle through sheer determination. After 23 years of brutal war, Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily, Rome's first province beyond the mainland. But peace was fragile, and vengeance brewed in Carthage's heart. Then came Hannibal. A name whispered with awe and fear even centuries later. Son of Hamilcar Barca, sworn by his father to hate Rome. He would become one of the greatest generals the world has ever known. In 218 BCE, Hannibal crossed the Alps, not with ships or legions, but with elephants, soldiers, and an unyielding will. The journey was a feat so extraordinary it became legend. He descended into Italy like a storm. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and finally at Cannae, he annihilated Rome's armies. Entire legions perished. The fields of Italy were soaked with Roman blood. But Rome refused to surrender. The Senate did not negotiate, the people did not despair. The Republic tightened its grip, raised new armies, and sent its finest commander, Scipio, to strike at Carthage itself. At Zama, in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal. Carthage was humbled, stripped of power, and Rome emerged as the master of the western Mediterranean. But victory came at a cost. Rome had seen what power could achieve, and power would soon corrupt her. The transformation of Rome. After Carthage's fall, Rome's expansion became unstoppable. Greece, Macedonia, and the eastern kingdoms fell one by one. The wealth of the world flowed into Rome, and with it came greed, ambition, and inequality. The Republic, once founded on modesty and virtue, began to fracture under the weight of empire. Generals grew rich on conquest. Politicians bought loyalty. The Senate, once the heart of Roman wisdom, became a battlefield of egos. Yet still, the idea of Rome, the Republic, endured. It would take another century for the cracks to split open. As new provinces swelled the empire's borders, the burden of governance grew heavier. The farmers who once formed Rome's backbone were displaced by slaves and estates owned by the elite. The poor crowded the city, demanding bread and justice. And into this restless world stepped new names, names that would echo for eternity. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and above them all, Julius Caesar. The Republic had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had lost itself. The same courage that built Rome now began to tear her apart. The soldiers no longer fought for the Senate, nor even for Rome herself, they fought for the men who paid them. For their generals. For their promise of glory. And among these generals stood one who seemed touched by destiny, Gaius Julius Caesar. Born to a patrician family but loved by the people, Caesar was both aristocrat and revolutionary. He understood that Rome's true power no longer lay in the marble halls of the Senate, but in the hearts of her legions and the hunger of her citizens. When others saw decay, Caesar saw opportunity. He rose swiftly, first as consul, then as governor of Gaul. There, across the Alps, he unleashed an unrelenting campaign of conquest. For nearly a decade, his legions marched through forests and rivers unknown to Roman eyes. They faced fierce tribes, the Helvetii, the Nervii, the Belgae, and one by one, he broke them. He crossed the Rhine, he landed in Britain, and with every victory, he sent letters back to Rome, tales of triumph, written in the calm, sharp voice of a man who knew his legacy was already being carved into eternity. But the Senate feared him. They feared not his sword, but his ambition. When Caesar's command ended, they ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They hoped he would bow, as others had before. But Caesar was not made to kneel. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, uttering the words that would seal Rome's fate: Alia iacta est. The die is cast. Civil war erupted, Rome against Rome. Brother against brother, senator against soldier, friend against friend. Caesar moved swiftly, brilliantly. He marched on Rome, then to Spain, Greece, and Egypt, crushing his enemies one by one. In Egypt, he met Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, radiant and cunning, and together they became legends entwined by love and politics. When he returned to Rome, he was not merely a general, he was the undisputed master of the Republic. But Caesar did not crown himself king. He understood the weight of that word, the poison it carried. Instead, he called himself Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. To his followers, he was a savior. To his enemies, a tyrant in disguise. And so, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, as he entered the Senate, they struck. 23 daggers fell upon him, wielded not by foreign enemies, but by men he had once called friends. Et tu, Brute? Even you, Brutus? The Republic, they said, was saved. But in truth, it had died with him. The end of the Republic. Caesar's death did not restore freedom, it unleashed chaos. His assassins fled, believing the people would cheer. Instead, Rome wept. The crowds rioted, burned their houses, and demanded vengeance. The Republic had no center left, only factions. In the void, new powers rose: his loyal friend Mark Antony, his ambitious rival Lepidus, and his adopted heir, a quiet young man named Octavian. They formed the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance forged in blood and revenge. Together they hunted Caesar's killers across the world. At Philippi, Brutus and Cassius fell, and with them, the last defenders of the old Republic. But peace between victors is short-lived. Antony ruled the East beside Cleopatra. Octavian held Rome and the West. Their friendship, like the Republic, crumbled under the weight of ambition. Propaganda turned to hatred, hatred to war. Octavian declared Antony a traitor, claiming Cleopatra had bewitched him, that he had betrayed Rome for Egypt's queen. In 31 BCE, their forces met at Actium, a naval battle that would decide the fate of the world. Under the blazing Mediterranean sun, Octavian's fleet triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, cornered by defeat, they chose death over capture. The world mourned its lovers, but Rome gained its first emperor. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a savior of peace. The Senate, weary of war, bestowed upon him a new title, Augustus, the Exalted One. The Republic was gone, but its corpse was dressed in gold. The birth of the empire. Augustus understood what Caesar did not, that power must hide behind the illusion of order. He kept the Senate, the consuls, and the ancient titles, but behind them stood only one will, his own. He reformed the army, rebuilt temples, restored laws, and filled the city with marble and hope. Rome, once fractured by civil war, now pulsed with unity. The gates of Janus, symbol of war, were closed, a sign that peace, at last, had returned. This was the dawn of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, 2 centuries of relative stability and prosperity. The empire expanded across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Roads stretched like veins from the capital to the edges of the world. Cities rose in Gaul, Hispania, Africa, and Syria, each a reflection of Rome herself, each carrying her laws, her language, her gods. Merchants traded silk from China, spices from India, gold from Nubia. The Mediterranean became Mare Nostrum, our sea. The legions guarded its borders, not just with swords, but with a belief that they were the bringers of civilization. Yet even in this golden age, shadows lingered. For an empire built by conquest must always look outward, and fear what lies beyond. The builders of empire. After Augustus came Tiberius, a man of caution and paranoia. Under his rule, treason became a whisper that could destroy lives. Then came Caligula, young, brilliant, and mad. He proclaimed himself a god, built palaces of excess, and demanded worship. His reign was short, ended by his own guards. Claudius followed, timid, underestimated, yet a scholar and reformer. He conquered Britannia, expanding Rome's dominion to the misty isles. And then came Nero, artist, showman, and tyrant. His name would be etched in infamy. When fire consumed Rome in 64 CE, he was blamed for it, whether justly or not, the legend endured, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Under Nero, the persecution of Christians began, a small, strange sect that refused to worship Rome's gods. Few could imagine that this faith, born in obscurity, would one day rule the empire itself. When Nero died, chaos returned. The empire saw a year of 4 emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, each rising and falling in rapid succession. Vespasian, pragmatic and stern, restored order. His sons, Titus and Domitian, continued his legacy. Titus witnessed triumph and tragedy alike. He completed the Colosseum, the grand arena of Rome, but also faced disasters, the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii, and a plague that swept through the empire. Domitian, like many before him, fell victim to his own ambition. But through these storms, the empire endured, resilient, unbroken, unstoppable. The eternal city. To stand in Rome at its height was to stand at the center of the world. Marble temples gleamed beneath the sun. Aqueducts carried water from distant mountains. Markets overflowed with the wealth of continents. The Forum buzzed with senators, philosophers, and merchants. The Colosseum thundered with cheers as gladiators fought beneath the eyes of emperors. From a village on 7 hills, Rome had become an empire of 70 million souls, stretching from the sands of Egypt to the cliffs of Britannia, from the Rhine to the deserts of Arabia. Its legions were feared. Its laws respected. Its culture admired and imitated. But beneath the grandeur lay unease. The people had grown dependent on bread and spectacle. Power no longer flowed from the Senate or the people, it rested solely in the emperor's hands. Rome, once a republic of citizens, was now a kingdom in all but name. And though few could see it, the seeds of decline had already been sown. The river that birthed Rome still flowed, unchanged. Its waters had seen shepherds, kings, generals, and gods. Empires, like men, are born, rise, and fall. But Rome was different. She did not simply exist in stone and blood, she lived in the idea of herself. An idea too powerful to die, even when her body crumbled. The Republic had fallen. The Empire had risen. And soon, history itself would bow before her. Part 2, The Glory of Rome. The Republic was gone. The wars were over. And in their ashes, Augustus built something the world had never seen, a peace so vast, so golden, it stretched from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the deserts of Arabia. For the first time in centuries, Rome rested. The legions laid down their swords, and cities flourished like flowers after fire. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But peace in Rome was never the absence of power. It was power perfected. Augustus ruled not as a king, but as a symbol. He spoke of restoring the republic, yet every senator, every soldier, every citizen knew, the republic had become a ghost. In its place stood something greater, something eternal, the empire. He rebuilt the city in marble, raised temples to the gods, and filled the streets with the rhythm of triumph. The poor received grain. The wealthy feasted in villas carved with myth and luxury. Poets sang of Rome's destiny. Virgil wrote, "Thou, Roman, remember to rule the nations with thy power." And rule they did. The heart of empire. At the center of this vast machine stood the city, Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city. 1,000,000 souls lived within its walls, a wonder beyond imagination. Aqueducts arched over hills, pouring fresh water into fountains and baths. Markets overflowed with silks from China, spices from India, gold from Nubia. The air smelled of incense, sweat, and empire. In the mornings, the forum came alive, senators in white togas debating beneath marble columns, merchants shouting prices, philosophers arguing under the shade of temples. By night, the city glowed with oil lamps, taverns, and whispers of intrigue. Rome was no longer a place, it was a world unto itself. The emperors after Augustus. When Augustus died, Rome mourned as if a god had fallen. His stepson, Tiberius, inherited the purple. Tiberius was a man of silence and suspicion. He ruled from a distance, retreating to the island of Capri, watching Rome through spies and letters. Under him, fear became the law. Yet even in his shadow, the empire grew. Then came Caligula, young, reckless, brilliant, and unhinged. He dressed as Jupiter, rode his horse into temples, and demanded divine worship. For 4 years, the empire teetered between comedy and nightmare, until his own guards ended him with their blades. In his place, they found Claudius, a man scholars mocked as weak, stammering, limping, hidden behind books. But Claudius proved them wrong. He was cunning, methodical, and bold. He conquered Britannia, the fog-shrouded island at the edge of the known world, and brought it under Roman rule. His reign restored the empire's dignity, but even emperors are mortal. He was poisoned, perhaps by his wife, Agrippina, and with his death rose her son, Nero. The fire and the fiddle. Nero was young, artistic, and cruel. He dreamed of glory, of music and theater, of being loved not as emperor but as performer. But Rome did not want a poet on the throne. In 64 CE, fire swept through the city, 9 days of destruction. Half of Rome was ash. Thousands died. And in the ruins, rumors spread, that Nero had ordered it, to clear space for his golden palace. Whether true or not, the image stuck, Nero, standing on a balcony, playing his lyre as the city burned. When the people turned against him, he turned against the people. He blamed a small, strange sect, followers of a man called Christus, who refused to worship the Roman gods. They were tortured, crucified, burned alive, their deaths feeding the torches of the night. Yet even as their bodies turned to ash, their faith spread like wildfire. In the end, Nero too was hunted, abandoned by all, dying alone, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." The year of 4 emperors. After Nero's fall came chaos. In a single year, 4 men claimed the throne: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Vespasian, a soldier of discipline and humor, restored order. He taxed, rebuilt, and began construction of the greatest arena ever conceived, the Colosseum. A monument to Rome's might and appetite, it could hold 50,000 souls. Here, emperors entertained the masses with blood, gladiators clashing beneath the roar of the crowd, beasts from Africa unleashed upon the sand, executions turned to spectacle. For Rome, violence had become theater, the empire's most honest art. The Golden Dynasty. Vespasian's son, Titus, finished the Colosseum and earned the people's love. But fate tested him, first the eruption of Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii in ash, then a great fire, then plague. Even so, he ruled with humanity and died young, mourned sincerely, which was rare for emperors. His brother Domitian followed, proud, paranoid, and cruel. He built, he murdered, he ruled like a god until his own servants cut him down. Yet from this bloodline's ruin came stability once again, the 5 good emperors, whose reigns marked the height of Rome's civilization. The 5 good emperors. Nerva, wise and cautious, restored balance between Senate and army. He adopted a general as his heir, Trajan, a Spaniard by birth, soldier by soul. Under Trajan, Rome reached its greatest extent. From the sands of Arabia to the hills of Scotland, from the Rhine to the Tigris, all bowed before the eagle. In Dacia, modern-day Romania, he carved victory into stone. The Trajan's column still stands today, spiraling with the story of conquest. But empire cannot live by conquest alone. His successor, Hadrian, understood this. Where Trajan expanded, Hadrian fortified. He traveled across the empire, inspecting every province, every border. In the north, he built Hadrian's Wall, dividing Rome's world from the wild lands beyond. Hadrian loved Greek art, philosophy, and beauty. He built temples, libraries, and cities, and mourned deeply for his companion, Antinous, whose death in the Nile became legend. After him came Antoninus Pius, gentle, just, and peaceful. He ruled for 23 years without war, a rarity in Roman history. And then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. The philosopher emperor. Marcus Aurelius was unlike any emperor before or after. He did not seek glory, he sought wisdom. While others built monuments, he built words. His meditations, written in the midst of war, still echo through time. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. B1. His reign was noble, but burdened. Plague ravaged the empire. The northern tribes pressed against the borders. The legions bled in endless campaigns. He fought not for conquest, but for preservation, for the fragile dream of peace his forefathers had built. But even philosophers die. And when he did, his son inherited the throne. His name was Commodus. The beginning of the end. Commodus believed he was Hercules reborn. He dressed as a gladiator, fought in the arena, and renamed Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana. Where Marcus ruled with wisdom, his son ruled with vanity. The Senate despised him. The people feared him. In 192 CE, he was strangled by his own servant. With his death, the golden age of Rome ended. The empire that had known 2 centuries of peace began to crack. A world of marble and shadows. But before the fall came a final moment of brilliance, the civilization that had shaped the ancient world in its image. Roman engineers built roads that still exist. Their aqueducts carried life across deserts and valleys. Their laws became the foundation of nations. Their language, Latin, became the root of Europe's tongue. Rome was not merely a conqueror, she was a teacher. She taught architecture, philosophy, governance, and the art of empire itself. But the same roads that carried her legions would one day carry her enemies. The same stones that built her temples would one day be taken to build her tomb. For no empire, however eternal, can escape the slow weight of time. The sun set over the Tiber, gilding the rooftops of Rome in amber light. Children played in courtyards, soldiers marched home through arches of triumph, and somewhere in a quiet study, a philosopher wrote about virtue and fate. The city seemed immortal. The empire unshakable. But in distant forests, beyond the Rhine and the Danube, tribes gathered, watching, waiting. They had seen the riches of Rome. And they knew her strength was also her weakness, too vast, too proud, too certain of her own eternity. The eagle still soared high. But the wind beneath its wings was changing. Part 3, The Soldiers of the Eagle. The empire stood vast and gleaming, but every marble arch, every silent statue, every road that reached toward the horizon existed because somewhere a soldier kept watch. Rome's peace was not the gift of the gods. It was the discipline of men beneath standards of gold. They called themselves legionaries, children of no single city, sworn to an idea. Each carried 40 kilos of armor and hope, marched 20 miles a day, built camps as precise as temples, and fought with a unity that frightened the world. Wherever they went, they planted the eagle. And wherever the eagle stood, there was Rome. The making of a legion. In the camps along the Rhine and Danube, new recruits arrived, farm boys, wanderers, freedmen, sometimes barbarians seeking citizenship. They swore the sacramentum, an oath to obey their commanders and never abandon their standards. Their lives became rhythm: wake before dawn, drill with shield and javelin, eat coarse bread and lentils, sharpen spade and sword. They learned to build walls, bridges, roads. A Roman soldier was half engineer, half storm. Commanding them was the centurion, scarred, relentless, the spine of the legion. His vine staff struck more often than his sword. Discipline was absolute, cowardice meant execution, defiance, crucifixion. And yet, under such iron order, they forged loyalty stronger than blood. The machine of conquest. Each legion carried its name and honor like a soul: the Gemina, the Fulminata, the Ferrata. They were 30 cohorts of precision, a storm moving in formation. Before battle, the trumpets sang, the standards rose, and every man repeated the same prayer: Jupiter, watch over us. Mars, grant us victory. Rome, remember our names. They advanced behind the testudo, shields locked like the shell of a god, arrows hissing against bronze. They broke enemy lines with discipline, not fury, patience, not chaos. And when the killing was done, they built again, forts, roads, and monuments marking the edge of civilization. Each stone whispered, here, the world ends, here, Rome begins. The northern frontiers. Beyond the Rhine lay a wilderness the Romans called Germania, dark forests, rivers like veins of glass, and tribes that refused to kneel. For decades, Rome tried to tame it. Then came the disaster. In 9 CE, in the Teutoburg forest, 3 legions under Varus marched into fog and betrayal. The trees closed around them. Arminius, a German raised in Roman service, turned against his masters. For 3 days, the legionaries fought, cut down tree by tree, mile by mile, until silence swallowed the forest. When word reached Augustus, the old emperor tore his robes and cried, Varus, give me back my legions. Those legions were never rebuilt. Their numbers, 17, 18, 19, were struck from the rolls, their eagles lost to the woods. Rome learned that not all lands could be ruled. So the empire drew a line. It built walls instead of roads, forts instead of cities. Peace through boundaries. Life at the edge of the world. In Britannia, soldiers watched mist rise from stone circles older than memory. In Egypt, they marched beneath suns that turned armor into mirrors. In Syria, they gazed upon deserts that shimmered like seas. They lived, loved, and died far from home. In forts and frontier towns, they married local women, raised half-Roman children, taught Latin and law. The empire became a mosaic, each garrison a seat of Roman life. At night, fires glowed along the borders, tiny stars guarding civilization. From above, it would have looked like the Milky Way drawn across the earth. The brotherhood of the sword. Within the legion, friendship was sacred. Each man trusted the one beside him more than his own kin. They shared food, scars, and stories of home. When a comrade fell, the legion buried him with honors, a laurel branch and a coin for the ferryman. And the march went on. They believed that the eagle, carried before them, was more than a symbol, it was the soul of Rome. If it fell, shame followed; if it rose, immortality. Centuries later, when barbarians found broken eagles in river mud, they still glowed with myth, rebellion and revenge. But not all who wore Roman armor stayed loyal. The empire was too vast, its ambitions too heavy. In Judea, revolt flared, first under Vespasian, then Titus. Jerusalem burned, the temple fell, and its treasures filled the Colosseum's vaults. Rome celebrated, an entire people mourned. In Britannia, Queen Boudica rose against the invaders, her warriors painting their faces blue, her chariot screaming through Roman lines. For a moment, it seemed even women and farmers could shake the eagle's shadow. But discipline prevailed, and her rebellion was crushed beneath Roman steel. The legions triumphed, but each victory carried a cost. For every province conquered, another needed guarding. And the more they guarded, the thinner the empire became. The Eastern Sun. In the east, the legions faced a different enemy, the Parthians, masters of cavalry and deceit. At Carrhae, Rome tasted humiliation when Crassus led his men into the desert and lost both life and pride. Years later, Mark Antony tried to avenge him and failed. The lesson was eternal: the East could not be conquered by Rome's methods. Its sands swallowed armies. Its riders fought with the wind itself. Still, trade flowed. Silk, spices, ivory, treasures crossed deserts along the Roman roads, guarded by soldiers who no longer remembered what they were fighting for. The cost of the eagle. For centuries, service meant 25 years. Few returned home. Those who did were rewarded with land, a pension, and citizenship. But after generations, the burden grew. Recruitment faltered. Emperors filled the ranks with foreigners, Goths, Franks, Syrians, men loyal to pay, not to Rome. The legions, once Roman to the bone, became mercenaries in Roman armor. They still marched, still fought, but something in their eyes had changed. They served an empire they no longer understood. Discipline and decay. In the days of Marcus Aurelius, the army still held the line, fighting tribes across the Danube. But plague struck, killing thousands. The emperor himself led from the front, sleeping in tents, writing philosophy by torchlight. After him came commanders who seized the throne by sword. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of emperors, became their killers. Power passed like a helmet, battered, blood-stained, and temporary. The soldiers, who once defended Rome, now decided her rulers. Every camp was a throne, every legion a crown. The warrior emperors. From the chaos rose a new breed of rulers, soldier emperors hardened by frontier life. Septimius Severus, Caracalla, Aurelian, names forged in war. They expanded, crushed rebellions, rebuilt walls. But their victories were Pyrrhic. Each war drained the treasury, each triumph demanded another. The empire was fighting itself, taxing, bleeding, consuming. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, reunited the fragments of empire, surrounded Rome with a massive wall. Yet even he saw the truth: the eagle's wings were tired. The legion's legacy. By the 3rd century, the legions were shadows of their former glory. Still, their discipline endured. Wherever archaeologists dig today, Britain, Germany, Syria, they find their signatures, tiles stamped with legion names, tools carved with initials, graves aligned in order. They built half the known world, and in doing so, built the world that followed. Their roads became Europe's highways. Their fortresses became towns. Their Latin words became law. The empire would one day crumble, but the soldier's imprint would never fade. The last march. In the end, the legions stood where they had begun, at the edges of civilization, facing the forests of the unknown. They had conquered nations, gods, and themselves, but not time. The eagle standard still glimmered in the sunset, wings outstretched toward eternity. A symbol not of conquest now, but of endurance. For every empire that came after, Byzantine, Ottoman, British, looked to Rome's soldiers and saw the blueprint of power. Discipline. Order. The road. The legion had become a memory the world refused to forget. The wind carried the echo of marching feet through ruined forts and buried camps. Somewhere, a helmet lay beneath the soil, its crest turned to dust. And yet, in the silence, one could almost hear it, the steady rhythm of men who once believed they could hold the world together. The empire would soon face storms greater than any army. Faith would challenge the gods. Gold would lose its worth. And the borders, once guarded by Rome's finest, would crumble. But for a moment, one brief, shining moment in the long night of history, the soldiers of the Eagle stood unbroken. Part 4, Blood and Faith. The empire that once worshipped 1,000 gods was changing. Beneath marble temples and crowded forums, a quiet tremor ran through its heart, a question no sword could answer, a faith no emperor could command. Rome had conquered the world, but could she command the soul of mankind? It began in whispers, stories passed between slaves, fishermen, and widows. In the alleys of Antioch, the markets of Corinth, the crowded tenements of Rome itself, a new creed spread, one that spoke not of conquest, but of compassion. It told of a man from the distant province of Judea, a carpenter's son who healed the sick, comforted the broken, and defied the powerful with words instead of weapons. To the Roman mind, such a man was madness, and yet, something about his story refused to die. The name Christus began to echo in reports sent to governors and legates. The local cult, they said. A superstition, dangerous only in its defiance of the gods of the state. But with every attempt to silence it, the faith grew stronger, spreading along Rome's own arteries, her roads, her ships, her legions. For centuries, the empire had prided itself on its tolerance. Egyptian gods stood beside Greek philosophers in the temples of the capital. Emperors themselves were made divine. But the Christians offered no sacrifices. They refused to bow before Caesar's statue, for they claimed there was only one king, invisible, eternal. That was not rebellion of the sword, but of the spirit, and Rome feared both. The first persecutions were small, almost bureaucratic. Christians were asked to burn incense to the emperor, to prove loyalty. Many did not. Some vanished into prisons. Others were thrown to beasts beneath the sand of the Colosseum, their deaths cheered by thousands who did not understand why such people would die for a name. And yet, they did, calmly, with prayers upon their lips. From the ashes of their sacrifice, faith spread faster. Every martyr was a seed, and the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the Church. In the 2nd century, as the empire reached its greatest expanse, the legions guarded borders that seemed eternal. But within, doubts crept in. Plagues, famine, political decay, the gods who once favored Rome grew silent. Astrologers and mystics filled the gap, selling meaning to those who could no longer find it in marble idols. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, reason and superstition walked side by side. Marcus wrote of duty, of endurance, of accepting fate, but even he could not silence the unrest that haunted his age. Christianity, though still a forbidden sect, spread into the households of senators, merchants, even soldiers. The empire's own instruments, its order, its communication, carried the gospel farther than its founders could imagine. By the 3rd century, the empire entered chaos. Emperors rose and fell in months. The frontiers burned. And through that turmoil, a strange thing happened: the persecuted faith endured when emperors did not. In catacombs beneath the city, paintings bloomed, crude yet powerful depictions of hope, a shepherd carrying his sheep, a fish etched into stone, a promise of resurrection. While the empire crumbled below it, something eternal was taking root. When Diocletian rose to power, he saw Christianity as a disease infecting the body of Rome. To restore the gods was to restore order, he believed. His reforms strengthened the state, divided the empire into east and west, but his persecution, the great persecution, became infamous. Churches were burned, scriptures destroyed, believers hunted. But the fire that was meant to destroy only tempered the faith. Then came Constantine. He was not yet emperor when he saw it, a sign in the sky before battle, a cross of light, and the words, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer. Whether miracle, vision, or symbol, it changed the course of history. At the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine fought beneath that sign and won. The next year, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of worship throughout the empire. For the first time, the cross was no longer a mark of shame, but of triumph. The empire of Jupiter had become the empire of Christ. But peace brings its own struggles. When persecution ceased, debate began. The faith that had survived in caves and catacombs now faced the challenge of power. What did it mean to follow a humble savior in an empire of gold and marble? Bishops gathered, councils formed, creeds written, words meant to unite, but which often divided. The city of Rome, once center of all gods, became the heart of one church. The old temples fell into ruin, their priests forgotten. But the people still needed grandeur, ritual, certainty, and the church provided it, with incense and procession, vestments and hymns echoing through vast basilicas that mirrored the temples they replaced. Constantine's reign reshaped more than faith, it remade the empire itself. He founded a new capital on the Bosporus, Constantinople, the new Rome. There, East and West would meet, and the empire would live on for another 1,000 years. But with that founding came a fracture that would never heal, the division of empire and church, of Rome and Constantinople, of Latin and Greek. Even as bishops argued theology, even as emperors built churches instead of arenas, the shadow of old Rome lingered. Pagan philosophers still taught in Alexandria. Vestal virgins still tended their sacred flame until Theodosius, in the late 4th century, extinguished it forever. With that act, the last breath of the old religion faded. Rome, the mistress of nations, had bowed to a carpenter's god. But unity came at a cost. When the church gained power, it began to mirror the empire itself, hierarchical, political, rich. Some said it had traded persecution for privilege, and purity for control. Yet through all its contradictions, faith gave meaning to a civilization adrift. By the dawn of the 5th century, as barbarian tribes gathered beyond the Rhine and Danube, Rome looked inward, proud, yet fragile. The gods of her ancestors were gone, but the spirit that had made her endure remained, now dressed in new robes. From the wooden cross rose a new symbol of empire, the cross of conquest, of salvation, of destiny. The empire that had crucified Christ had become his vessel on earth. And so, as the eagles still flew over ruined frontiers, monks copied scripture in candlelight, missionaries carried faith to the edges of the known world, and emperors sought divine right to rule what was left of Rome's dominion. Blood and faith had reshaped the empire. The sword had built Rome, but now belief would preserve what stone could not. A civilization once defined by conquest was learning to conquer the heart. For the old empire, the question was no longer how long could it last, but what would endure when its walls finally fell? Because the body of Rome could die, but her soul, bound now to faith, might never. Part 5, The Age of Crisis. The marble that once gleamed beneath the sun now cracked. Roads that had carried legions now carried refugees. The empire that had seemed eternal stood at a precipice, not felled by a single blow, but by 1,000 quiet fractures spreading through its veins. It was the 3rd century after Christ. For nearly 300 years, Rome had been the unchallenged master of the world. From the Scottish highlands to the deserts of Arabia, from the Atlantic Ocean to the rivers of Mesopotamia, her shadow stretched across continents. But empires die not in battlefields alone, they die in their hearts. The Pax Romana, that long, improbable peace, was over. The crisis began with a crown, or rather, with too many of them. In 235 CE, the Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered by his own soldiers. With his death, the last of the Severan dynasty fell, and the throne became a prize for any general bold enough to seize it. In a single half-century, more than 30 emperors would rise and fall, some reigning for years, others for months, some for only days. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. For the Romans living through it, it was something simpler, and far worse, chaos. In the provinces, governors declared themselves emperors. Legions swore allegiance not to the Senate, not to Rome, but to the man who paid them. The Rhine and Danube, once borders of pride, became lines of invasion. Goths poured across the Balkans. Vandals raided Gaul. The once mighty limes, those frontier fortresses, burned beneath foreign banners. Within, the economy collapsed. Silver coins were debased until they were little more than copper with a shimmer. Trade slowed to a trickle. Famine followed plague, and plague followed war. Cities shrank. The great baths grew cold. The forum fell silent. For the first time in centuries, people began to ask a question once unthinkable: could Rome fall? The legions fought bravely, but even they could not stand against hunger, corruption, and despair. In the east, a new power rose, the Sassanid Persians. They were heirs to the old Persian kings, and they burned with the zeal of renewal. Under King Shapur I, they invaded Roman Syria and captured Antioch. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, Emperor Valerian himself was taken prisoner, the first Roman emperor ever captured alive. The Persians paraded him as a trophy, a living symbol of Rome's humiliation. Legends say Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Whether true or not, it was a story Rome would never forget. In the west, the empire fractured further. A Gallic Empire formed, an independent state ruled by Postumus, with its own army and emperor, its own illusion of order. In the east, Palmyra rose, the desert city of queens and caravans, led by the brilliant and ambitious Zenobia. She ruled from Egypt to Anatolia, her banners flying beneath the desert sun. For a time, Rome was no longer one. But even in ruin, there were men who would not let her die. Out of the turmoil came Aurelian, a soldier born of the frontier, hard and disciplined, forged in the chaos that had broken others. When he took the throne in 270 CE, the empire was splintered into 3 pieces. In 5 years, through cunning and relentless war, he made it whole again. He crushed the Goths on the Danube, defeated the Palmyrene armies, and took Zenobia captive in chains, though Rome would later remember her not as an enemy, but as a queen of courage. He reclaimed the Gallic Empire and restored the unity of Rome. They called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Yet even restoration came at a cost. The people, weary and superstitious, longed for certainty. Aurelian turned to the gods, or rather, to one god above all, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He built temples to this deity, declaring him protector of the emperor and the empire. In this sun god's light, the seeds of monotheism, already growing through Christianity, found imperial expression. But Aurelian's reign was brief. Like so many before him, he was murdered by his own officers, victims of rumor and paranoia. The empire survived, but the sickness within it deepened. As the century waned, the emperors became soldiers, administrators, survivors. They ruled from the saddle, moving from front to front, never resting. Gone was the Senate's dignity, gone the old ideals of the Republic. Rome was now an army, its emperor's warlords in purple. Then came Diocletian. He was a man of order, of iron, of vision. Rising from humble birth, he seized the throne in 284 CE and looked upon a shattered empire, and decided it could no longer be ruled as one. He divided it, east and west, giving each half its own emperor and junior colleague, a system he called the Tetrarchy. For rulers, one empire, a delicate balance of power meant to stop the chaos of civil war. For a time, it worked. Diocletian reformed the army, the administration, the economy. He set prices by decree, fixed taxes, standardized weights. His rule was absolute, yet it brought stability. Cities rebuilt. Trade resumed. The borders held once more. For a brief, fragile moment, Rome breathed again. But power built on fear cannot last forever. Diocletian's vision demanded control, of coin, of sword, and of soul. To unify his empire, he sought to restore the old gods. The Christians, growing stronger with each generation, refused him. His response was fury, the great persecution. Churches were torn down, scriptures burned, believers tortured. It was the last and fiercest attempt to erase the faith that had taken root in Rome's heart. And it failed. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the first emperor ever to do so voluntarily, he left behind an empire both saved and wounded, strong yet divided, faithful yet fractured. He retired to his villa in Dalmatia to grow cabbages, while his successors plunged again into civil war. Out of that chaos, one man would emerge, Constantine, the Emperor of the Cross, who would fuse empire and faith, sword and scripture. But that was still to come. For now, the empire stood at the crossroads of worlds, east and west, pagan and Christian, old and new. Its marble cities gleamed again, but its soul trembled. The legions still marched, but their ranks were filled with mercenaries. The frontiers still stood, but beyond them, the storm was gathering: Goths, Franks, Huns, names that would one day echo like thunder over Rome's graves. In this age of crisis, the empire learned a cruel truth, that no wall, no army, no emperor could hold back time itself. And yet, even as the world crumbled, something endured: the idea of Rome. For Rome was not just a city, nor an empire. It was a memory, a dream, a mirror in which every civilization would one day see itself. As the fires of war dimmed and the stars rose over a fractured world, a question lingered in the air: if Rome could not rule forever, could her spirit still outlive her fall? Part 6: Constantine and the Cross. The empire was broken, but not yet lost. Its body scarred, its spirit divided. The legions still guarded the frontiers, but now they fought less for Rome, and more for the man who promised them gold. From the dust of the 3rd century chaos, a new world began to rise, one of intrigue, faith, and the slow rebirth of order. The year was 306 CE, and the name that would echo through history was Constantine. He was born in the shadow of chaos, son of an emperor and a woman of humble birth. He had seen the empire from its edges, the forts of Britain, the camps of Gaul, the barracks of the Danube. He understood the soldiers, their fears, their hunger for loyalty in a world without certainty. And above all, he understood Rome itself, weary, but yearning for salvation. When his father, Constantius, died in the northern city of Eboracum, York, the legions proclaimed Constantine emperor. But in the east, others did the same. Rome was again divided, its throne claimed by rivals, each declaring himself the chosen one. The empire was too vast, too tired, to serve many masters. Only one could remain. Constantine marched from west to east, gathering power like a storm. And as he moved, he carried with him not only the sword, but a symbol that would change the fate of the world. On the eve of battle near the Milvian Bridge, where the Tiber shimmered beneath a dying sun, Constantine looked to the sky. Ancient writers tell us he saw a sign, a cross of light, blazing above the clouds, and the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. What he saw, we cannot know. But he believed it. When dawn came, his banners bore the symbol of the cross. The battle raged, and Constantine's forces prevailed. Maxentius, his rival, drowned in the river, and the city gates opened. For the first time, the empire's future and the faith of a crucified savior stood together on the same road. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, a decree of toleration that ended the centuries of persecution. Christians were free to worship. Their churches rebuilt. Their scriptures no longer burned. Rome had once crucified Christ. Now it carried his emblem into battle. The emperor's mother, Helena, herself a convert, traveled to the Holy Land in search of the relics of that faith. Legends say she found the true cross, the very wood upon which Jesus was hung. Whether true or myth, the story spread like light through the empire's veins, from the hills of Judea to the marble basilicas rising in the capital. Constantine did not destroy the old gods overnight. Their temples still stood, their statues still watched. But their silence grew heavier with every passing year. The emperor had seen a vision, and in it, Rome's destiny had changed course. No longer would empire and divinity be separate. Rome's sword would now serve the cross. Yet even as faith rose, Constantine knew that stone could not stand where the heart was weak. The old capital, the eternal city, had become a monument to memory. Its senators whispered of glory, but its walls decayed. The empire's pulse had shifted eastward, to the trade routes, the wealth, the promise of a new beginning. And so, Constantine looked to a narrow strait where Europe met Asia, Byzantium. A city of hills, harbors, and horizons, commanding two worlds. There, he built a new capital. He called it Nova Roma, the New Rome, but the people called it something else, Constantinople. Its walls rose high, its forums shone with gold, its churches crowned the skyline with domes like suns. The emperor filled it with relics from across the empire, statues of old gods, mosaics of new saints, the spirit of all that Rome had been and all that it would become. When Constantine walked through its gates, he must have known he was walking through history itself, not as the founder of a city, but as the bridge between worlds. In his reign, the empire regained its breath. Laws were reformed. Corruption punished. Armies reorganized. For a time, the chaos seemed to still. But peace is never eternal, and even the light of a new age casts long shadows. Constantine's embrace of Christianity brought unity, but also division. For within the faith itself, voices clashed. Who was Christ, man or God? What was his nature, his essence, his place within the divine? Theologians debated with the same fury that generals once fought. Councils were called to preserve truth, but truth, like empire, was fragile. At Nicaea in 325 CE, bishops gathered from across the known world. There, beneath the emperor's gaze, they forged the first great creed of the Church, a declaration of belief meant to unite the faithful. But behind every word lay a struggle of politics, of power, of interpretation. Constantine, once the conqueror of nations, had become a mediator of souls. His empire was no longer held together by legions alone, but by belief, and belief was harder to command than any army. He ruled until his last breath with the cross as his emblem, but baptism as his final act. Near death, he laid aside the purple robe of emperors and took upon himself the white garment of the baptized, as if to cleanse his spirit from the blood and ambition that had defined his reign. When he died in 337 CE, the empire mourned him not as a man, but as a legend, Constantinus Magnus, Constantine the Great. His body was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by 12 empty sarcophagi, one for each apostle, as though even in death he stood among saints. But his legacy lived on in ways even he could not have foreseen. For the empire he left behind was no longer the same as the one he had inherited. It was now a world divided, Latin in the west, Greek in the east. 2 capitals, 2 cultures, 1 empire in name only. And at its heart, the faith of a carpenter had become the crown of kings. The old gods had fallen silent, but the old ambitions had not. Emperors after Constantine would wield the cross as both shield and weapon. Faith and power would intertwine until neither could be separated from the other. The Church, once persecuted, now sat beside the throne, shaping laws, guiding kings, deciding the fate of nations. But beneath the splendor of this new Christian empire, the ground still trembled. Beyond the Danube, the barbarians gathered, stronger, bolder, driven by hunger and hope. To the north, the Goths. To the east, the Persians. To the south, the endless sands of Arabia. And in the west, the ancient heart of Rome, the lights began to dim. Constantine had built a new Rome to save the old one, but in doing so, he may have doomed it. Power had shifted eastward. The Senate was a shadow, the legions thinned, the treasury drained. The eternal city, once mistress of the world, was now a relic of its own legend. But for a while longer, the illusion of strength endured. The sons of Constantine divided the empire once more, and with each division came new wounds. The faith their father had crowned became a weapon in their rivalries. Heresies bloomed like wildfires, each claiming truth, each burning the others. In distant deserts, monks withdrew from the world, seeking holiness in silence. In marble cities, bishops debated philosophy while famine haunted the streets. Rome had traded gods of war for gods of doctrine, but the wars continued, only under different names. And yet, beneath it all, the soul of civilization endured. The schools of Athens still taught Aristotle. The baths still steamed. The mosaics still glittered with gold. Merchants still crossed the sea, carrying silk and spices, stories and ideas. For all her decline, Rome still held the world's imagination, not as a conqueror, but as a memory. As the 4th century waned, the first whispers of doom grew louder. On the frontiers, refugees from the north, the Goths, begged for entry into the empire, fleeing something more terrible still, a new power rising from the steppes, swift and merciless, the Huns. The Roman generals allowed the Goths to cross the Danube, promising them safety in exchange for loyalty. But greed and cruelty turned the promise to betrayal. Starving, humiliated, the Goths rebelled. At Adrianople in 378 CE, Rome met them in battle. The Roman army, proud and disciplined, marched as it had for centuries, and was destroyed. The Emperor Valens fell in the field, his body never found. For the first time since Cannae, Rome had been utterly broken. The illusion of invincibility was gone. The empire that had once tamed nations could no longer tame itself. The age of Constantine had been one of rebirth, of faith, of light-piercing darkness. But every dawn brings its twilight. The empire had found a soul, but in finding it, it had lost its center. In the east, Constantinople gleamed like a star, impregnable, magnificent, alive with trade and theology. In the west, Rome aged in silence, its marble flaking, its people clinging to the echoes of glory. The empire of the cross had survived the crisis of the sword. But soon, even faith would not be enough to hold the world together. Beyond the walls, the tribes were waiting, restless, watchful, patient. And in the distance, thunder rolled over the horizon. The old order was ending. A new world was stirring. The empire had been reborn once. It could not be reborn again. The next fall would be final. Part 7, The Fall of the West. The old eagle of Rome no longer soared. Its wings, once gilded with conquest, now hung heavy with centuries of dust and defeat. The Western Empire, the original Rome, the heart of civilization itself, had grown weary. Its breath came shallow, its pulse uncertain, its greatness a story whispered more often than witnessed. It had survived civil wars, economic collapse, religious transformation, and endless invasions. Yet now, in the 5th century after Christ, the Western world stood on a precipice. The empire that had outlasted kings and kingdoms now faced a new enemy, time itself. The Roman world was no longer a world of citizens, but of survivors. Across the marble ruins of old cities, the vines of decay crept higher each year. Aqueducts still stood, but dry. Forums echoed with the footsteps of ghosts. The Senate still met, but its words were powerless murmurs. And yet, Rome had not yet fallen. It endured through inertia, through habit, through memory, through the sheer belief that it could not end. But the world around her had changed. The great migrations had begun. Entire nations were on the move, the Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, Burgundians, countless peoples, each driven by hunger, fear, or hope, pressing against the Roman frontiers like waves against a crumbling wall. For generations, Rome had relied on its borders, its legions, its diplomacy, a balance of gold, steel, and fear. But gold had grown scarce, the legions thin, and fear had shifted. The barbarians no longer trembled at the sound of Roman trumpets. They had seen too many Roman defeats. The story of the end began, as all endings do, quietly. In the year 376, a people called the Visigoths came to the Danube. They were fleeing the Huns, horsemen from the far eastern steppes who devoured everything in their path. The Goths begged for refuge, offering loyalty in exchange for Roman protection. Emperor Valens, ruling the eastern half of the empire, granted them passage. But greed and cruelty followed. Roman officials extorted the starving Goths, selling them rotten food at impossible prices, enslaving their children. Desperation turned to rage. 2 years later, the Goths rose up in arms, and the Roman legions met them near the city of Adrianople. It was one of the greatest armies the East could muster, disciplined, experienced, proud. Valens believed he could crush the rebellion in a single day. Instead, the Roman Empire met its most terrible defeat since Cannae. The Gothic cavalry surrounded the Roman flanks, their horses moving like thunder over the dry Thracian plains. By sunset, the Roman line had shattered. The emperor himself was killed, his body never found. Adrianople was not just a battle lost. It was an illusion shattered, the illusion that Rome was invincible. The barbarians could win. In the years that followed, the boundaries between Roman and foreign blurred. Generals recruited barbarian soldiers by the thousands, mercenaries, allies, or opportunists, depending on the day. These men fought for Rome, but not from love of empire. They fought for pay, for land, for survival. By the early 400s, Rome's armies were filled with those who no longer spoke Latin, who no longer cared for the ancient gods or the laws of the Senate. They carried the eagle standards of Rome, but in their hearts, they belonged to a different world. And then came the man who would show Rome her reflection, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. He had once served in the Roman army. He knew their ways, their discipline, their pride. But Rome had denied him his due, had treated him as less than Roman. He remembered that insult. In 410 AD, Alaric marched his army toward the eternal city itself. Rome, the city that had not been taken by foreign hands in 800 years. The city that had conquered the world. The people could not believe it was possible. Even in ruin, they thought Rome eternal. But when the gates were opened, whether by betrayal, despair, or fate, the unimaginable became real. For 3 days, the Visigoths roamed the streets of Rome. Temples were stripped, palaces looted, the golden statues of the emperors torn down. Yet, even in destruction, Alaric spared the sacred churches, for he was a Christian, and this was not vengeance, but destiny. The shock of that moment spread across the world. Saint Jerome, hearing the news in Bethlehem, wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat, and sobs choke my words. The city which has taken the whole world is itself taken." But the fall of 410 was not the end, only a sign of what was to come. After Alaric, others followed. Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, seizing Carthage and cutting off Rome's lifeline of grain. The western treasury, once overflowing, now echoed hollow. The legions in Gaul deserted. Britain, once the pride of Roman expansion, was abandoned. The emperors became ghosts, ruling in name, serving at the mercy of generals who rose and fell faster than the seasons. And yet, through it all, the Eastern Empire, the realm of Constantinople, endured. Its walls unbroken, its gold intact, its emperors shrewd and watchful. They called themselves Romans, and indeed they were. But in the West, the light was fading fast. The last great figure to try and hold that flickering flame was Flavius Aetius, called the last of the Romans. He was a man of two worlds, raised among the Huns as a hostage in his youth, educated in Roman strategy and politics, fluent in both the diplomacy of barbarians and the intrigue of senators. When Attila the Hun invaded Gaul, it was Aetius who united Romans and Goths against him. At the Catalonian plains in 451, they met, the most fearsome battle of its age. Tens of thousands died as the sun set red over a field of dust and bones. Attila, the scourge of God, was forced to retreat. Rome had won a reprieve, not a victory, but a breath before the end. Yet even Aetius could not save her. A few years later, he was slain by his own emperor, Valentinian III, who envied his power. The emperor himself was soon assassinated. Without Aetius, the West had no savior left. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, who came by sea from Africa. They stripped the city of its treasures so thoroughly that the word Vandal would forever mean destruction. By now, the Western Empire was but a shadow. The emperors were puppets, crowned and unseated by barbarian generals. The Senate clung to its rituals, but its authority was a hollow echo. And then came the final act. In 476 AD, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer entered Italy. He defeated the last Roman army, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, a child more symbolic than sovereign, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. There was no battle, no siege, no grand speech. Just a quiet surrender. The Roman Empire, which had once stretched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain, ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. And yet, even as the eagle's wings folded, the Roman spirit did not die. The laws, the language, the architecture, the memory, they endured. Kings called themselves Caesars. Churches rose where temples had stood. Latin lived on in prayers and books. Rome had fallen, but Rome would never be forgotten. In the east, the torch still burned. In the shining city of Constantine, the dream of empire lived on, older, wiser, unyielding. The world had changed, but the shadow of Rome still stretched across it. The empire had ended. The idea had just begun. Part 8, The Eastern Empire and Justinian's Dream. The old empire had fallen, or so it seemed. In the west, the marble cities were broken and the legions gone. But in the east, where the Bosporus met the sea, where Europe and Asia touched hands, Rome still breathed. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the city of the world's desire. Here, the Roman Empire endured not as a memory, but as a living power, reborn in silk and gold, ringed with mighty walls, and crowned with 1,000 domes. The old Romans had called their realm the Residential Publica. The new emperors called it Basileia Romaean, the empire of the Romans. To them, there was no Byzantine Empire. There was only Rome, eternal and unbroken. The West might have fallen to ruin, but the true empire still stood, luminous and defiant. It was a world of contradictions, ancient yet reborn, pagan in its bones but Christian in its soul. Greek had replaced Latin as the language of power, and the old gods had faded into myth. Yet the dream of empire, of order, of glory, of civilization itself, still lived in the hearts of its rulers. And none dreamed that dream more fiercely than Justinian. He came to power in 527 AD, not a noble by birth, but the nephew of an emperor, a man of obscure origins from the rugged lands of Illyria. He was small in stature, with sharp eyes that seemed to look past the horizon. His vision was simple and impossible, to restore Rome to its ancient greatness. He believed he had been chosen by God to complete what centuries of emperors had begun, to reunite the world under one faith, one law, one empire. His reign would be one of fire and marble, of triumph and ruin, of a dream so vast it nearly consumed the empire itself. The city he ruled was unlike any in the world. Constantinople was a jewel set between two continents, its harbors filled with ships from Egypt, Arabia, and the Black Sea, its markets echoing with the voices of Persians, Armenians, Syrians, and Greeks. Within its walls lived more than 500,000 souls, a living monument to all the ages of Rome. Theodora was his empress, and his equal. She had once been an actress, a woman of the stage, dismissed by polite society. But she possessed a mind of steel and a heart of flame. Together, Justinian and Theodora ruled not as monarchs, but as visionaries, convinced that they could bend history to their will. But even the greatest vision begins in darkness. In 532, just 5 years into Justinian's reign, Constantinople burned. The Nika riots, what began as a clash between rival chariot factions, erupted into open rebellion. The Hippodrome, once a place of sport and celebration, became a battlefield. The mob called for Justinian's overthrow. For a moment, he wavered. The imperial treasury was empty, the city aflame, the palace surrounded. His advisors urged him to flee across the Bosporus. But Theodora refused. Legend says she turned to her husband and said, "Those who have worn the crown should never live to see it laid aside. Royal purple makes the noblest shroud." And with that, Justinian made his choice. He ordered his general, Belisarius, to act. The troops stormed the Hippodrome. When it was over, tens of thousands lay dead, and the empire was his again. Out of the ashes of that rebellion, Justinian built his masterpiece. Hagia Sophia. The Church of Holy Wisdom. It rose like a vision from heaven itself, its vast dome seeming to float upon air, its golden mosaics shimmering like sunlight on the sea. When it was finished, Justinian stood beneath its vaults and cried, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was more than a church. It was the empire made stone, the dream of Rome transformed into light. But marble dreams are expensive. To restore the empire, Justinian needed gold, and soldiers. In the west, the barbarians had carved kingdoms from the ruins of Rome. Vandals ruled in Africa, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain. To Justinian, they were all usurpers, pretenders who held what belonged to Rome. And so he sent forth his general, Belisarius, young, brilliant, and loyal. A man of both cunning and honor, often compared to Caesar himself. With a handful of men, he sailed to Africa in 533 and struck like lightning. The Vandal kingdom, once thought unassailable, collapsed in months. Carthage returned to Roman hands. From there, he moved to Italy, to reclaim the ancient capital itself. The Gothic wars were brutal. For years, cities were besieged, fields burned, and countless lives lost. Rome changed hands 6 times. Yet, in the end, Belisarius triumphed. The Empire of the West was, for a moment, reborn. But the victory came at a terrible price. The treasury was drained. The population was ravaged. The land itself seemed exhausted by the endless wars. And then came the invisible enemy. In 541, the plague struck, the first great pandemic of recorded history. It came from Egypt, carried by ships, and spread through the harbors of Constantinople. The streets filled with the sound of mourning. Corpses piled faster than they could be buried. It is said that in the peak of the pestilence, 10,000 people died each day. Even the emperor himself fell ill. He survived, barely. But the empire would never truly recover. The dream of restoration faded beneath the shadow of death. In his later years, Justinian turned inward. He codified the laws of Rome, centuries of decrees, customs, and traditions, into a single body, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian. It would outlive the empire itself, shaping the laws of Europe for 1,000 years. He rebuilt cities, reformed administration, and guarded the faith with a zeal that bordered on obsession. Heresy was hunted, paganism extinguished, even philosophy itself driven underground. For all his brilliance, Justinian could not escape the limits of his own ambition. The empire he left behind was vast but fragile, glorious on the surface, hollow within. The West was reconquered, but depopulated and poor. The East was weary, its fields abandoned, its gold spent. And when Justinian died in 565, the dream died with him. After him came emperors lesser in vision but equal in burden. The borders began to contract again. The Lombards swept into Italy, taking what Belisarius had won. The Persians struck in the east, pushing deep into Syria. Yet still, Constantinople endured. Its people believed that theirs was no ordinary city, but the center of the world, a place chosen by God. Within its triple walls and under its golden domes, the empire survived storms that would have destroyed any other. But far beyond the deserts of Arabia, a new force was rising. A faith that would spread faster than any army, reshaping empires and remaking the world. When the followers of Muhammad came out of the sands with the cry of Allahu Akbar, they brought with them a new world, one that would test the endurance of the old. Syria fell. Egypt fell. North Africa followed. The great Mediterranean, once Rome's Mare Nostrum, our sea, now belonged to another. And yet, when the Arab armies came to the gates of Constantinople, the city stood firm. The secret of Greek fire, the empire's terrible weapon, turned the sea itself into flame. For 7 centuries more, no army would breach those walls. The Roman Empire, now Byzantine in all but name, became a fortress of faith, its armies smaller, its gold diminished, but its spirit unbroken. Through the centuries that followed, emperors rose and fell, monks copied sacred texts in candlelight, scholars debated theology as wars raged outside the city's walls. The empire that once ruled the world had become a lonely island of civilization, standing between East and West, between memory and oblivion. And still, it endured. For the people of Constantinople, Rome had not fallen. It had only transformed, purified by centuries of fire, tested by time, and kept alive by the stubborn faith that history itself could be defied. But the world was changing again. New powers were rising. In the West, a Frankish king named Charlemagne would call himself Emperor of the Romans. In the East, the caliphates would rule lands once filled with Roman legions. And as centuries turned, the empire that had once stretched across continents was reduced to the walls of one city, one shining, stubborn dream on the Bosporus. The glory of Rome had become a memory, but it was a memory that refused to die. Part 9, The Long Decline. The empire still stood. Against every storm, every siege, every famine and plague, the city of Constantine had endured. 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the west, its eastern twin remained, solitary and defiant, a flame flickering in the winds of time. But even the brightest flame consumes itself. By the 9th century, the Roman Empire, the Basileia Romaean, had become something both ancient and new. It was no longer the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, nor the Rome of Justinian and Belisarius. It was an empire of monasteries and mosaics, of saints and emperors, of silk and scripture. Its capital, Constantinople, still gleamed, the queen of cities, the envy of the world. Merchants from Venice and Genoa crowded its harbors, spices from the east perfumed its markets, gold still flowed through its hands. But beneath that splendor, the old strength had faded. The frontiers were gone. The legions of iron and discipline were replaced by mercenaries, soldiers who fought for coin, not country. The emperors, once masters of the known world, now bargained with kings and sultans for survival. Yet, even in decline, Byzantium shone with a strange brilliance. It was a world unlike any other, a living museum of antiquity and faith. Here, the wisdom of Greece and the majesty of Rome mingled with the mysticism of the East. The works of Aristotle and Plato were still studied. The chants of monks echoed through the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The emperor still ruled as God's chosen on earth, his throne gleaming beneath a canopy of gold. But the world beyond the walls was no longer the world of the Caesars. In the West, new powers had risen, the Holy Roman Empire, born under Charlemagne's sword, the papacy, wielding a crown of its own, the restless kingdoms of Europe, growing bold and hungry. And in the East, an even greater force had emerged, Islam, whose empires stretched from Spain to India, from the Sahara to the steppes. For centuries, the Byzantines stood as the frontier between two worlds, Christian and Muslim, Latin and Greek, Europe and Asia. Theirs was a sacred mission, they believed, to preserve the light of civilization in an age of darkness. But even sacred missions must bend beneath the weight of centuries. The cracks began to show not in battle, but in faith. In 1054, a quarrel between Rome and Constantinople, over words, over pride, over the meaning of God himself, became a wound that would never heal. The Great Schism. The Pope and the Patriarch excommunicated each other, dividing Christendom into East and West, Catholic and Orthodox. To many, it seemed a dispute of theology, to history, it was a fracture of unity. From that moment, the empire was alone. When danger came from the east, from the steppe tribes and the Seljuk Turks, there was no help from the Latin West. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Roman army met the Turks in the mountains of Anatolia, and was utterly destroyed. The emperor was captured, the empire's heartland was lost. Anatolia, the land that had fed and armed Byzantium for centuries, fell to the invaders. The empire that had once stretched across continents was now a handful of provinces, ringed by enemies. And yet, somehow, it endured. The walls of Constantinople still stood, vast, immovable, magnificent. The people still called themselves Romans. Their faith still filled the great domes with light. They still believed they were eternal. But eternity is never free. When the call of the Crusades rang out from the West, the emperor saw a chance for salvation. He asked the Pope for aid, and aid came, but not as he expected. The Crusaders came not to restore Byzantium, but to claim their own glory. They marched through the empire like conquerors, suspicious of the Greeks they called heretics. Yet together, they retook Jerusalem in 1099, and for a moment, the Christian world rejoiced. But the alliance between East and West was a fragile lie. By the 12th century, the Latins no longer saw Byzantium as a partner, but as a prize. The queen of cities, rich, ancient, and undefended by friends, tempted their greed. In 1204, the nightmare came. The Fourth Crusade, meant to march to the Holy Land, instead turned its ships toward Constantinople. What followed was one of the darkest moments in Christian history. The Crusaders stormed the walls, looted the churches, burned the palaces. For 3 days, they tore the city apart. The Hagia Sophia, that golden house of God, was desecrated. Horses stabled where priests once prayed. Relics and icons were smashed, melted, or stolen. The treasures of 1,000 years vanished in a single fire. When it was over, the empire was gone. For 50 years, the Latin Crusaders ruled from Constantinople, calling themselves emperors of Rome. The true Byzantines fled, to Nicaea, to Epirus, to Trebizond, shards of a broken empire clinging to survival. And still, they endured. In 1261, from exile, they struck back. The exiled Emperor Michael Palaiologos retook the city and restored the empire. The people wept, the bells rang, and for a moment, the dream of Rome flickered back to life. But the empire he reclaimed was no longer an empire. The population was small, the treasury empty, the army scattered. The trade routes had shifted to Venice and Genoa, draining the city's wealth. The restored Byzantium was an echo of its former self, a relic surviving on memory, not might. And all the while, a new power was growing to the east. Across the Anatolian plains, the Turks had not vanished. From the ashes of the Seljuks rose a new people, fierce, devout, relentless. The Ottomans. They began as a small frontier principality. Within a century, they were an empire. City after city fell to their crescent banners. Adrianople became their capital. Their horsemen swept across the Balkans. Their cannons roared where once legions had marched. By the 14th century, Byzantium was surrounded, a single candle burning in a sea of darkness. The emperors pleaded with the West for help. They offered unity with the Catholic Church in exchange for armies, but the people of Constantinople resisted. They would rather die Orthodox, they said, than live as traitors to their faith. The West sent words, not warriors. So the empire waited. For deliverance. For mercy. For the end. And yet, even in decline, Byzantium remained magnificent. Travelers who entered its gates in those final centuries described streets paved with marble, palaces lined with mosaics, domes shimmering in the sun. The Hagia Sophia still glowed like heaven's lantern. The people still sang hymns to the Mother of God. The emperor still held court in his tattered glory, wearing robes once woven for Justinian. They knew they lived among ruins. But they also knew those ruins were sacred. To live in Constantinople was to live at the center of the world, even as the world forgot them. It was a strange kind of grace, to stand so close to eternity that even ruin felt divine. And so the centuries passed. The empire dwindled to a memory, a city, a faith, a dream. But that dream would end in fire and thunder. For beyond the horizon, a new sultan was rising, young, brilliant, unstoppable. Mehmed. The son of Osman, heir to the Ottoman dynasty. He called himself Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. He would not rest until Constantinople, the last jewel of the old world, was his. Part 10, The Echo of Empire. The empire was gone. Not in an instant, not in a single moment of ruin, but in silence, over years of forgetting. The Roman eagle had fallen, its bronze wings broken, but its shadow still covered the world. The year was 476 CE. In the great halls of Ravenna, a small, weary figure sat upon a throne that no longer ruled an empire. Romulus Augustulus, a boy crowned emperor, handed his crown to a barbarian general named Odoacer. There was no rebellion, no thunder of armies. The boy simply surrendered what had already faded. The Western Roman Empire, once ruler of all lands touched by the Mediterranean sun, ended not with fire, but with the soft sound of a crown laid down. Yet, the story of Rome was never meant to end. The stones remained. The language survived. And the dream, that a city could command the world, still whispered through the centuries. In Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine world, still gleamed with gold mosaics and imperial pride. Justinian would one day reclaim parts of the West, rebuild the Hagia Sophia, and proclaim that Rome still lived. But the unity was gone. The idea had become an echo, chasing its own reflection across time. The people who once called themselves Romans now prayed in new tongues, under new gods, within the ruins of old temples. Paganism had yielded to Christianity, the sword to the cross. The emperor had become the servant of God, and the church inherited the empire's moral crown. What Rome could no longer command by force, faith now claimed by devotion. But the bones of empire endured everywhere. In the roads that still cut across Europe, the bridges that spanned rivers no longer patrolled by legions, in the laws that whispered through every court that would ever rise after. Even the barbarians who had broken Rome could not escape its shadow. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Lombards in Italy, all built kingdoms that called themselves heirs to Roman order. They crowned their kings in imitation of Caesar's and wrote their charters in the tongue of Latin. They carried fragments of Rome in their blood. Centuries passed. New powers rose, the Carolingians, the Holy Roman Empire, the Church of Rome itself, all reaching back toward that vanished glory. The popes of the Middle Ages would call themselves guardians of a divine Rome. Emperors from Charlemagne to Frederick II would march east and west to resurrect what could never truly be restored. Every city that dreamed of empire carried, secretly, a Roman wound. Even as the Eastern Empire waned, surrounded by the crescent banners of Islam, Constantinople stood as the last mirror of that ancient dream. The marble domes, the gold, the bureaucracy, the proud legions, all ghosts of an empire that refused to admit its death. And when, in 1453, the great city fell to the Ottomans, it was not simply Byzantium that perished, but the last living ember of Rome itself. Yet, as the smoke rose over Hagia Sophia, something extraordinary happened. The scholars who fled the falling city carried with them the manuscripts of Cicero, Livy, Virgil, Aristotle, and Plato. They fled to Italy, to Florence, to Venice, and the Renaissance was born. Rome, even in death, had seeded rebirth. From the ashes of its empire rose a new one, not of soldiers, but of ideas. Artists sculpted gods and emperors once more, painting humanity in the perfection that Rome had once imagined. Architects rebuilt temples and domes. Philosophers spoke again of virtue, law, and reason. The old empire had dissolved into time, but its mind lived on, reawakening 1,000 years later under the hands of men who believed themselves its spiritual sons. The legacy of Rome flowed forward, into the Enlightenment, into the revolutions of Europe and America, into the notion that law could be reason without passion, that power should answer to the people, that civilization must be preserved through order. Every republic and senate born after carried a spark of that eternal city. And so, the fall of Rome was never truly a fall. It was a transformation, of stone into thought, of empire into myth. What could not endure in flesh endured in story. In our modern age, Rome still speaks. In the arches of our capitals, in the Latin roots of our languages, in the very word civilization, which the Romans themselves gave us. We walk upon their roads, live under their laws, and tell their story again and again, as though it were our own. Perhaps it is. For Rome was never just a city. It was an idea, that human will could shape the world, that greatness could be built and preserved, that from chaos could rise order, and from dust, eternity. Empires before it have risen and fallen, Persia, Byzantium, the Ottomans, the British, and each has carried a glint of that ancient fire. And perhaps one day, even our own age will crumble into memory. The skyscrapers will fade like the marble of the Forum, and the cities we think immortal will lie silent beneath future sands. But in the ruins, a child will still pick up a coin, trace the worn face of an emperor, and whisper the name of Rome. Because Rome never truly ended. It lives in the pulse of civilization itself, in ambition, in art, in conquest, in law, in our endless need to rise, fall, and rise again. It lives every time a man builds something that outlasts his life. It lives when a people refuse to vanish. And so the story of Rome is not the story of a fallen empire, but of the human condition, our triumphs, our failures, our longing for permanence in a world of change. The marble may have cracked. The legions may have turned to dust. But the idea of Rome, the dream that began on the banks of the Tiber under a wolf's watchful eyes, endures, eternal as time itself. In the ruins of empire, we find our reflection. And in that reflection, we remember, all things fall, but some never truly die. Rome was mortal. But the dream of Rome is forever.